All right, so today we're going to be learning about advanced CSS and some libraries for CSS. So let's start with advanced CSS. We're going to be going over CSS combinators, display types, content overflow, and animations. So first, we're going to need to set up a playground. So open up your browser and type in play.tailwindcss.com. And we're going to add a little skeleton to work with as we do that. Is this Zoom okay? Do you want me to zoom in a little more, or is it good? I'll just zoom in a little more. I'll give everyone 30 more seconds. Do we have a question? Okay. 10 more seconds. All right. So first, we're going to talk about CSS combinators. So they specify relationships between our CSS selectors. So some examples would be HTML tags such as the div or p, which means paragraph tag. You guys are also familiar with class names. So those are also a type of selector. We have 4 different CSS combinators we're going to be looking at. We have the descendant selector, the child selector, the adjacent sibling selector, and the general sibling selector. So the descendant selector is a space between 2 selectors. And what it does is it matches all elements that are descendants of the specified element. So for example, in this code right here, we're saying .container, which is our class. And then we have another selector that selects a div. And with the space between, what it's doing is it's selecting every single element that's a div that is within this element right here, .container. So if we look at our code, .container is going to be our parent element. And it's going to select every single one that is a div that's a child. And this doesn't matter how nested it is. So if you look inside our first section right here, there's a div that's a subchild. That'll actually be selected no matter how deeply nested it is. So we can go into the CSS section and we can add that just like the code on the screen. And you'll see that all 4 elements have changed font size, even though one of them is nested a level further than these 3 right here. The next selector is called the child selector, and the child selector matches all elements that are direct children. So this is different from the descendant selector in that it must be in the level below the parent. So yeah, further levels of nesting will mean that it'll be ignored by the selector. So if we go into our CSS section again, and instead we change up here to the caret and then add div right here, you'll see that on the right, only child 2, child 3, and child 4 actually change font sizes, while subchild remains the same font size. All right, the next one is the adjacent sibling selector. So this selects a single element that is going to be directly after another specific element in the tree. So in this example right here, the element directly after the element with ID C1. So why don't we take a look at our HTML? This is the element right here with the ID of C1. And it's selecting the next div that is directly after this. So if we look at the order, this is our object with ID C1, and the next div after that is going to be this element right here. So let's go into our CSS, and why don't we add that? Remember that hashtag in front of text represents a ID, and a dot represents a class. And you're going to see that because child2 is the first div that's directly after the element with ID C1, that's the only one that's going to change text color to be red. All right. And the last one is called the general sibling selector. So as the name may suggest, it's general. So it's going to select all the elements that are going to be after the specific element that you specified. So in this example right here, you're going to use the squiggly line right here, and it's going to say, so after the element with ID C1, we're going to be selecting all divs that precede it. So if we look in the code again, this is our element with ID C1. So that means it should select all these divs right here. So we can go into our CSS. We can change this plus. And you're going to see child2, child3, child4 all change font color. All right. So next, we're going to talk about display types. So the display property just allows us to tell the browser how we're going to display an element and its children on the page. So we've already looked at block and flex, and we're going to look at two more, and it's grid and none. So first, let's update the code in our playground. So just go into your HTML and change this section so that it's just another child. And then you can also go into your CSS and just get rid of everything except the container class and just leave it like that. I'll give everyone 30 seconds to do that. All right. So we're going to talk about first the display grid. So this is telling the browser that we're going to display the child elements of a parent in a two-dimensional grid layout. So this is what it looks like in CSS. So why don't we write that in our class? We're going to write display with grid. And you're going to see nothing has changed yet. And that's because grid automatically, if you don't provide any other options, grid just stacks them up as rows. So that brings us to grid autoflow. So autoflow is a property that gives us the power to tell the browser how we want to automatically handle child elements once we reach the end of our grid layout. So we have two options. We have row, which instructs the browser to prioritize adding rows. So by default, grid is going to prioritize rows, which is why if you see in our example, child1, child2, child3, child4, they're all stacked up on each other instead of forming horizontal columns. And then columns instructs the browser to prioritize adding columns. So those are what the two properties look like in your code. And we'll go try them out. So yeah, so this is what it'll look like. You can go into the CSS section and add it yourself and try that. So row is the default behavior. Nothing's going to change. If we change it to column, you'll see that it splits it into columns. All right. Next, we have grid template rows and grid template columns. So this property allows us to template rows and columns. So the number of rows and columns corresponds to the width and height respectively. So yeah, so let's start with grid template rows. So the number of values is going to specify the number of rows with that height. So to give more detail, so we have the example grid template rows 100 pixels, 100 pixels. So what that does is it creates a grid layout. And since we're using rows, that means they're going to stack. And it's saying that the first two elements in rows 1 and 2 are going to have a height of 100 pixels. And you'll notice in the example right here that subsequent rows, if you don't specify a value, they'll just use a default height to fit the element, which is why you'll see the first two elements, they have a height of 100 pixels, and then these two just have default heights. So you could try that in your CSS. Next, we have grid template columns. So the number of values corresponds to the number of columns you have. Plus the values are going to be the widths of those columns. So in this example right here, we're saying grid template columns 100 pixels, 100 pixels. This is going to create a grid layout with 2 columns, and each of them are going to have a width of 100 pixels right here. And you can try that out in your CSS as well. Just try that. Now we're going to talk about display none. So display none tells the browser to remove the element from the document without taking up any space in the layout. So this might be different if you've heard of visibility hidden. And that hides the element, but it still takes up space in our layout. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, on the left, we have display none. So you can see that it doesn't actually take up any space in the grid layout. So that means, child 2 moves up, child 3 moves up, and child 4 moves up. But over here with visibility hidden, you can see that although we've hidden the element, it still takes up space in our layout. So yeah. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is content overflow. So the overflow property allows us to tell the browser how we're going to handle child elements that may be too large and exceeds the size of our parent element. So some values we're going to be looking at are visible, hidden, scroll, and auto. So let's again update our playground. So we're going to get rid of all the elements inside. We're just going to add a single paragraph tag. You can add whatever text you want, but just make sure it's pretty long. So once you've done that, you should see some sort of gray square at the top corner, and then the text that just basically is coming outside of the box. Give everyone 10 more seconds to write the code down. All right. So the first property is overflow visible, and that's our default behavior. And that just tells the browser, hey, it doesn't matter if we have content that's too big for the box, you can just show it. So that's what it looks like. In the CSS, you could add overflow visible or not. Again, it's the default behavior, but that's what it looks like. The next value is overflow hidden. So what that does is the browser saying, okay, if we have any overflowing content, we're just gonna clip it and basically hide it, so the user can't interact with it. And if you try and let's add overflow hidden. If you try and put your mouse inside the box and try and scroll or anything, it's not going to work. So try that. The next property is overflow scroll. So this is telling the browser to display a scroll bar for the parent element, which in this case is our gray square. And it's going to say that this scroll bar is always going to be present, even if there isn't any content that overflows. So you might not see it if you're on a Mac, but if you're on Windows, you'll see that there's most likely some sort of scroll bar here. And if you change the text to be like, let's just say 1 character, you'll still see a scroll bar, even though you can't actually scroll. So if you have changed it in your CSS to overflow scroll, you can put your mouse inside the gray square and you could see you're able to scroll within that square. And then lastly, we have overflow auto. And this is essentially the same as overflow scroll, except it's conditional. So we're only going to show the scroll bar if there is any overflowing content. And if there isn't, then we're just going to hide the scroll bar. All right, now we're going to talk about animations. So animations is how we give our HTML elements a movement. We're going to be looking at keyframes, calling our animation, the duration, animation delay, and timing functions. So one more time, let's just make sure we have the playground updated. We can get rid of everything in the container CSS class, and then your HTML should be the same. All right. So first, let's talk about keyframes. So keyframes basically describe the animation that we're creating and what's going to happen at every point in the animation. So in the code right here, you can see we have 2 keyframes. We have 0% and 100%, which basically means the start and the end of our animation. So first of all, when you create an animation, you need to write at keyframes, and then you have to write the name. So fade in is our animation name, and that's how we're going to reference this animation. And then we're going to be indicating different points inside this keyframe, inside these curly braces right here. So that's what we have right here, our 0% and 100%, which means our start and end of our animation. And then inside these, we give the CSS properties that we'd like to change or animate. So in this case, I'm going to be animating the opacity. So opacity 0, you won't be able to see it. It's going to be transparent. And opacity 1, it'll be solid, and we'll be able to see whatever we're animating. So go into your CSS and add those keyframes. So next we need to call our animation. So in the CSS section, go to .container. Inside, we're going to write animation fade in, which is the name of our animation. If you named it something different, then make sure to use that name. So next, we're going to tell it how long the animation should last. So that's going to be called animation duration. It's very straightforward. Just specify how long we want it. So in this case, let's make it 5 seconds. And you'll see already it's going to animate. Let's add a delay now. So same thing as duration, it's very straightforward. Animation delay. And then let's just say 2 seconds. So if you see when it refreshes, you'll see that there's a delay of 2 seconds before it actually fades in. So now we have timing functions. So these basically tell the browser what speed to progress our animation. So the default value is going to be ease, and that's going to be this graph right here. And it just has a slow start, you see a fast middle, and then a slow end. We have ease in, which is just a slow start right here. Ease out, which is the slow end. Ease in and out, which is similar to ease, but not so much fast in the middle. And then we have linear, which is just you can imagine a linear graph. It's a uniform speed. So we can actually add that in the container Let's just change it to, let's just say, let's go with ease out. And you can see it's really slow to finish the animation towards the end. All right, let's talk about CSS libraries. The one we're going to be looking at is Tailwind. We're just going to go through this. So Tailwind, it's a utility first framework. So it has a bunch of pre-made classes that makes development really quick and efficient. So an example of this is, let's say this pre-made class right here, m-4, and that just gives a margin of 4 pixels. The nice thing about Tailwind is that it allows us to write CSS in the same file as the HTML we're working with. So this makes the workflow a lot quicker and seamless because you're not constantly switching between files, which can get annoying. And also just the pre-made classes make it really easy to stay consistent. So when you make color choices, your typography, so your font sizes, the font families that you're using, it makes it really easy to stay consistent. Tailwind is also extremely low level, which means that rather than giving you some sort of pre-made components, you're going to be working directly at the lowest level possible and modifying each element with the classes yourself. And that means that you're going to have some more unique looking components, even though you might be using the same classes over and over again. And also Tailwind reduces bundle sizes, so it gets rid of any CSS code that you don't need, which means faster load times, which is always great. And it makes responsive design really easy. So it has a bunch of utility selectors that basically tells the browser how to handle certain changes when it comes to screen sizes. Okay, so we're going to try and replicate this tweet box using Tailwind. So make sure you have the playground open if you haven't already. And you can ignore everything in the CSS section because again, Tailwind allows you to write everything in one in your HTML file. So let's first identify some of the key structural elements that we're going to need to replicate this. For the sake of just simplicity, we're not going to actually copy these icons per se. We'll just add text to represent it. But if you want to, in your own time, feel free to look up some icons and put it in yourselves. So first we have some sort of container that wraps all the elements, and we can see that there's clearly some sort of padding. We have the bar at the top, so that's going to contain our close button and the drafts button. We have the profile picture. We have our text input with some sort of placeholder. We have this bar down here, which is just an indicator of who can reply. And then we have this bar down here, which has all these controls for the tweet and the post button. So first, let's build our container. So let's go into our HTML and create a section. And we're going to add a class right here. So in this playground, you'll have autocomplete. So a lot of these might be, you can probably infer what they mean. So BG stands for background, and they have a color palette that you can use. So we're going to use gray 900. W-full means it's going to have a width of 100%. And then P4 just means you're going to be adding padding on all sides with values of for REM, which is 16 pixels. Okay, so now that we have our container, you can see it's just a gray bar at the top yet because we haven't put anything in. We're going to add the top bar now with the close button and the drafts. So let's make a container for that. It's going to be a div, and then inside we're just going to use paragraph tags to represent the buttons. So let's just write close. So you'll see something like that right now. Give everyone 10 seconds to write that down. So this is what's going to be going inside. I would quiz you guys, but we're kind of low on time, so we're just gonna write that in. If you guys remember what Flexbox does, it basically creates a box that we can tell to either stack above or we could stack horizontally. In this case, justify between. What this just does is tells the parent element, okay, you want to space the elements apart. So that's what we're doing right here, and that's why you can see there's a space between. So now we need to add our profile picture and our text content. So we're going to add that underneath. So right here, we're going to create another container for that. So let's just go over quickly what some of these do. Gap4, use that for flex and grid, and that just basically says, the gap between each child, and you can hover over each of the classes to see what they actually do. So PY, you could see adds both a padding at the top and bottom. That's why it's the y-axis. If you specify T, that would just mean you're adding padding only at the top. Height H48 is just a height of 12 rem. They use REM, but and then this right here, this is our profile picture. We don't actually have an image, but we could just make it some blue circle for now. Aspect square forces it to basically say, no matter what, you want to maintain this ratio of 1:1, because sometimes, even though if you may specify the height and width to be the same, in certain cases where you have more elements that are kind of pushing it together, it might start to elongate, which is not what we want. And then rounded full is just a really, really high border radius to ensure that this element is a circle. Okay, so now we need to add the text area. So we can have this in the same container because they're all in one row. And right now we're using flex and the default behavior is a row. So that's why we're going to put it here. And there's a actual element in HTML that's called text area. Class. And then there's an HTML property that we can use, and it's called placeholder. And this just adds the text that we see. Okay. So a lot of these, again, are pretty self-explanatory. The one that might be a bit confusing here is focus outline none. And this is just a selector to say on the event that we focus on the text, we're going to hide any outline. So right now, if I click anything, you won't see anything. But if I get rid of this, you're going to see that there's this ugly outline right here, which is why I added that. So we won't see that. All right. Now let's add the indicator of who can reply. So we're going to put that underneath. We're going to go outside this div because remember, this is one section right here. The who can reply indicator is underneath that. So we're just going to go outside of that. And let's use a paragraph tag. Make the text bold. It's going to be blue. And we're just going to say everyone can reply. Close that tag. And then you might have noticed there was a small horizontal line, so we can add that too. HR just represents a horizontal line. You can use the border across the class to change the color of the horizontal line. And you can see now we have this everyone can reply, and then we have this little horizontal line right here. So we're almost done. And finally, we just have the tweet controls and the post button container. So let's build another container for that. I'm just going to use the nav element because it's sort of like a navigation in a way. But also it just helps to distinguish some of the elements. Let's add the class. So when you use item center on Flex, remember Flex, the default direction is going to be in the form of a row. So what item center does is it centers all the child elements on the horizontal axis. So if you don't use that, you might notice that the buttons, like right here, they might be uneven in a sense that like one might be higher than the other. So item center basically tells it to stay in the middle, basically horizontally aligned. So now let's add the container for the controls. So that. Take this and copy paste it. So you can see now we have these down here, which basically represents the buttons at the bottom. We just don't have the icons, but that's okay. Let's make sure we close that. And then finally, we're gonna add the post button. So this is just gonna go outside of this div, but still inside this nav class because it's in the same container. And we're just gonna add a button. And the text is just gonna be post. And you can see now we have a little button on the right here. And that is a very rough sort of mock-up of what the tweet prompt looks like. So you can feel free to mess around with some of these values and change it yourselves to see what it looks like. This is the final code. You can also just access right here. If you go to weblab.is/tailwind, you'll be able to see the full result and all the code. So if you didn't catch up, feel free to go there and just mess around with it and try it out yourself.